You are now watching the official YouTube channel for the largest basketball manager game in the world. Join at BuzzerBeater.com if you think you can beat the buzzer.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to Bubbles Buzzer Beater, the official Buzzer Beater YouTube channel. I hope the new season is treating everyone well, and I know that I'm enjoying my time up in Division 2 for the USA. And then my Utopia team is just training and continuing to do its thing. So pretty good season so far for my team, and I hope it's doing the same for you. Today I wanted to go over the art of blanking lineups and just kind of discussing, the history of blanked lineups, how it's changed from its original form, and why I think it is a big benefit to make use of, or at least have an understanding of, so that you can use it while game planning and strategizing for games in the future. So starting off with just what is a blank lineup. So if you haven't heard about a blanked lineup, or I know a lot of times people will just call it a BLU. So if you see BLU on the forums, that just means blank lineup. But a blank lineup is essentially when you're setting your lineup for a game and you intentionally leave two of the spots entirely blanked. So you're still like setting your standard kind of lineup, rostering those players. So, 8, 10, 11, however many players you're rostering. You still bring them to the game. However, you'll leave two of the spots completely blank. And essentially what this does is it disperses the minutes among those two spots, among those players who are not listed. So I'll get more in depth on how to actually set this up for your specific team. But essentially a blank lineup is just going to be setting 3 of these starting spots, backup spots, and reserve spots, and then leaving 1 to 2 of the other ones blank. Now, full blank lineups used to be a thing in Buzzer Beater, and it was something that was very big when there was more users on Buzzer Beater, but essentially managers were just able to blank all 5 positions, essentially letting the coach or the game engine decide what the ideal lineup was for their set tactics. So I know, look inside is very popular, but people would set look inside man-to-man, and then just a full blank lineup with the substitution being let coach decide. And this was a very good strategy. It led to very good substitution patterns and very good performances from players, but it was eventually deemed as too overpowered and easy, so Buzzer Beater actually removed the ability to blank all 5 positions. With that being said, managers can still blank 2 positions, so they can blank a maximum of 2 positions, which is still incredibly beneficial to make use of. As for the benefits of blanking 2 spots in your lineup, there's a lot of different perks of why blanking is beneficial for you, and I think the main one is just that the game engine ultimately is typically going to know what's best. So I know sometimes the game engine does a couple of peculiar things. You'll be like, why is my point guard playing center for a couple of possessions when I let coach decide? More times than not, however, the game engine will know what's best and what's ideal for the set offense and defense that you're running. The second thing is that blanking actually adjusts to tactics better than you can manually. So that kind of ties in with the first point of just saying that, the game engine is going to know what's best, but the blanking just adjusts to tactics better than you would. And I know there's times where for U21 where I've blanked a lineup and what I would have naturally set for starters isn't what happens, and I'm glad that the game engine set it differently than I would have, because it just goes to show that, we are humans, and the game engine is a computer that kind of maximizes out what it thinks is best, and blanking makes most use of that. Third is that blanking allows you to have more than 2 to 3 players eligible at a position. So blanking sets it up in a spot where you could eventually have 4 or 5 different players all play the center position, where if you're setting it manually, no more than 3 players could ever play center unless there's like injuries or foul outs. Fourth, blanking optimizes players' effectiveness in minutes. So it does a really good job with substitution patterns, as I mentioned, and ultimately it allows players to be more effective when they're on the floor, which kind of coincides with the fifth point, saying that blanking does help with player and game ratings. So those two essentially just are showing how blanking can maximize the way that your players are playing when they're on the court. And it also allows your team to better avoid player exhaustion. So I know player exhaustion is something that's still relatively new to BuzzerBeater, but if you're blanking players in like two spots, then those players have a much less likelihood of becoming exhausted because the game engine will naturally sub them out before they get to that point. And then the seventh thing is that blanking is more flexible for stamina-related reasons. So if you have any sort of players who have stamina problems, or maybe they have, 1 to 2 atrocious to pitiful stamina, this blanking method allows them to get substitutions in and out both more frequently and before they get tired and start to perform poorly. So after all that, this kind of leads to the question of when should you be blanking? And there's some main situations where I prefer blanking, and one of them is going to be when starters and their backups are closer in skill level and or game shape or DMI. So this is something where, as many of you know, I am a U21 coach and have been very involved with U21 game planning and national team game planning. But this is something that's much more common at those levels and those competitions, because on the roster of 18 that you have a lot more players who are high level and similar to each other. So that's where blanking is generally more useful in U21 and NT competitions, since a lot of the players are in the same or similar tier. And then blanking also allows you to use your team's depth to your advantage for your club. So if you're a club team where, maybe a lot of teams in your league only play, 7 to 8 players in their rotation, but you play 9 or 10, blanking can optimize those minutes and those players more, because you're going to have fresher players on the court if you're blanking compared to if you're just setting the lineup manually. Another reason when I really like to blank is going to be when you have 3 players that you would like to get the majority of the minutes across 2 positions. So this is a situation for my USA team where I have 3 bigs on the roster who are all very, very good for Division II. You'll see I have a $97,000 salary center. That's Stuart Cornell on the left side. And then I have 2 other bigs who are both very, very similar, but both $60K salary players. And for this reason, I don't like, setting one as a starter and setting the other as a backup, because one generally ends up playing way more minutes than, and they're very, very similar players. So in a situation where I'd like all 3 of these players to get the majority of the minutes at power forward and center, I do like blanking these players a lot. There is a spot where you can set both of the starters and then set one of them as the backup for both slots, but I just think blanking is far more effective and creates better substitution patterns. And then the other cool thing with blanking is if you do have a player who maybe deserves like a couple minutes just to give your players a breather, but not to get a ton of minutes, rather than setting them as a backup where they're likely going to get 10 to 15, 20 minutes depending on the game, you can actually blank, and then that player who's lesser than these 3 would get fewer minutes, but still give your players a breather and still play a limited role in the offense and defense. And then, as I said, blanking when your players have stamina issues is really beneficial. So if you have a team where maybe you're training some younger players and you just can't afford to train stamina once, twice a season, your starters and backups might not have the ideal stamina. So as a general suggestion, this will vary depending on how you view stamina, and each manager will have their own kind of preference. But in my opinion, if your starters do not have 6 or higher stamina, or if your backups do not have 4 or higher stamina, then blanking could be very beneficial for your team. And this is just because players are subbed out more frequently, so stamina becomes less of an issue with blanked lineups because they're getting more frequent rest than if you're setting the lineup manually for them. And then the last major one is going to be when you're not sure, which player should be starting in a specific offense or defense. So these are two players that I had on my roster last season when I was doing a playoff push in Division 3 USA. And generally, one of the two of them would play shooting guard or small forward, depending on the offense. And there was just times where I liked blanking shooting guard and small forward. And for different offenses, the game engine would do different things. So Ambler, you can see, had slightly better defense, both outside and inside defense, as well as better inside shot. Whereas Tango had better jump shot, jump range, and also better passing. So depending on the offense that we were running, the game engine would actually start Ambler in certain offenses and Tango in other ones. So that's where, once again, the game engine is going to be smarter than whatever a human's preference is. So this is a good time to blank is if you're just not sure which player is better. This is also the case where if you have a player who is better skill-wise, so let's say you had 125 total skill points small forward who was in 8 game shape, and then you had 110 total skill point player who was in 9 game shape. That's a tough situation where maybe it's hard for you to decide, which player should I be starting. The DMIs are about the same. I know this player's better, but they're in 8 game shape, whereas the player who's still good but not quite as high for total skill points, but they're in better game shape. Blanking a lineup could be beneficial in letting the game engine decide who should be starting in that situation. And then some main keys for when you're actually setting the lineup for a blank lineup setup. So the main thing is ensuring that you are blanking the starter, backup, and reserve for those 1 to 2 spots. And you're never blanking more than 2 spots in the lineup. If you ever accidentally blank 3 starters, for example, the lineup will actually be reset and not work the way that you want it. So never more than 1 to 2 spots, but you do want to blank the starter, backup, and reserve, so all 3 spots for that position. The second thing is that the players that you want playing a lot of minutes in the blank should never be set at any spot in the lineup. So you don't want to set them as a reserve in another spot, like in case of injuries or something. If you're blanking point guard and shooting guard, you don't want one of those players that you want to play in those blank guard spots to be set as the reserve small forward, for example, because then their minutes in the guard spots will be less than what you're expecting. And then when you are setting this, do make sure that they are still in the 12-man selected lineups. You want to make sure they're actually, rostered and in the lineup for the game. I know at least once I've done this where I blank the lineup, and since you don't actually see their name in the blank spot, you do want to make sure that they aren't, on the bench in street gear, that they're actually in uniform to play the game. And then the last thing is that reserves can occasionally play minutes at the blank spot. So if their skill set makes sense for the blank spots and the offense, sometimes my reserve small forward will play minutes at like power forward or center, if it makes sense, or vice versa with the guard spot. So do know that sometimes the reserves can play a limited amount of minutes at that spot if it makes sense for the blank lineup. And then the biggest one, substitutions should always be set to let coach decide. Let coach decide is what fundamentally makes the blank lineups work, because you're giving the game engine the right to make the substitutions and the ability to set the starters that it thinks is best. If you accidentally set substitutions to follow depth chart, then the blank will not work properly. And now I wanted to go through an example for my team. So, as I said, for my team specifically, I blank bigs a lot. These are the 4 bigs currently on my roster in Division 2 USA. So you can see Cornell, the 97K big, I have the two 60K bigs that I showed earlier, and then the fourth kind of big on my roster who I really like as a fourth option, and in case, any of my main three guys ever get injured, is this 32K center whose name is Doom. So this is kind of my four big setup. And then when I'm setting a blank lineup for these guys, there's games where I blank all four of them. There's also games where I blank just three of them and might set Doom as the backup small forward if I wanted to. And then this is an example of if I'm setting this lineup to blank the power forward and center spots, I do want to make sure that all four of the guys are still on the selected players. So you want to make sure that they're one of the 12 in the selected players option still. And then when you're actually setting it, this is how you would set it up. So substitutions, you want to make sure it's let coach decide. You want to leave the starter, backup, and reserve for power forward and center blanked all the way through. And then in this situation, I did put Doom or Lukashuk right there as the reserve small forward. So this is where I was primarily wanting to just get my three main big men most of the minutes, but I was also okay with Lukashuk getting a couple of minutes at, backup power forward or center if he needed to, or if the game engine thought that was best. And then what ended up happening was I ended up winning my BuzzerBeater Madness game and was very, very pleased with the results for how the blank lineup worked. So you can see that it ended up starting Koneza and Cornell, and the player ratings across the board were really, really good for my players, where you can see 15.5, 15.5, 15.0, and 14.0. And this was also the first BuzzerBeater Madness game, so this was before their game shapes were as high as they're shown right here. And then as for the minutes played at power forward and center, this was the minutes breakdown, which I really, really liked. So as I said, it started Cornell and Konesa, and they each played 29 minutes. And then Jarko, my backup power forward center, who is very, very similar to Konesa, he ended up playing 28 minutes. So I really, really love the balance of those three guys, all getting just under 30 minutes. They all stayed very, very fresh and all played very well. And then Doom or Lukashuk, he ended up playing 10 minutes at backup power forward center as well, including playing 7 minutes at small forward. So that's where you can see the reserve spot did play a little bit of minutes at power forward center, but that really is his natural position, so it makes sense that he played a little bit of minutes right there. And then just some general preferences. So these are the kind of things that I personally believe in, but I know other managers will have a different opinion on. So if you wanted to ask around in the forums or talk to other managers, I'm sure they'll have some pointers or tips as well. But my main preferences that I have is that I typically only prefer blanking power forward and center, point guard and shooting guard, or shooting guard and small forward. So essentially either bigs, guards, or wings. And I never really blank forward, so small forward and power forward. It's been weird with my roster at least, where the blank just doesn't work the way I want it to. I do know that other prominent managers have also had success blanking like power forward and shooting guard, or point guard and center, so two like positions that aren't closely related to each other. I know some managers blank those and have said that it works really well. And then some managers also have had success in just blanking one spot. So they'll just say, I have these three players. I'm just going to blank point guard and see what it does with them. And then everything else in their lineup is set. So I know that is an option as well. Another big one for my preference is that for U21 and national teams, I love blanking 5 guards or 5 bigs to cover 2 spots. So either, once again, power forward and center, or point guard and shooting guard. Having a 4 or 5 players blanked across those 2 spots, I think, is very, very effective. And I know that a big reason for this is because U21 players also oftentimes have like lower stamina because they're trying to add so many skill points before the competitions. So blanking is more valuable when you have players who have, like 2 to 4 stamina, and that's kind of where all of them are at. Do note that this is much harder to do for club teams since you won't usually have 5 viable players to play the same positions. But for U21 and national team coaches, I think this is a tip that I am very, very in support of, where blanking 5 guards or 5 bigs I think works really well. And then the last thing for me is I blank almost every buzzer beater madness game because the minutes don't count towards training, and they don't count towards like game shape or anything. But I don't always do it for league games. So blanking can sometimes be hard to predict, like how many minutes will be distributed. So you get an idea as you blank more and more of what you think will happen, but there's never a guarantee. So some teams might not be set to blank every single game, and I don't think my team is set up in a way where I want to blank every single game. With that being said, Buzzer Beater Madness is a great time to blink, and then playoffs are another time where I blink more often during the playoffs because usually I'm training game shape, and the minutes don't matter as much. So if someone ends up playing like more minutes than expected, it's not as big of a deal. But that's really all I had for this video. I think it's a very interesting concept, and I think the art of blanking is something that, not a lot of people know of or not a lot of people make use of. So what are your thoughts on, blank lineups? Do you use them? And what's your go-to blank lineup setup? I'm curious to hear if other people have had success like blanking small forward and power forward, for example, or if you blank one position. But if you have any theories or strategies that you think work really well, feel free to leave them down in the comments below, and I'm interested to hear more about that on the topic. So I'll go ahead and leave the video at that, but thanks for tuning in, guys, and I will be back with another video very, very soon for you guys. Cheers.